Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a truly fascinating and, honestly, kind of uncomfortable journey deep into the human ego. We're going to tackle a pretty massive question. How much of your life, your thoughts, and your choices are actually yours? I mean, we all walk around every single day feeling completely in control, right? We just assume we're these independent thinkers making totally rational choices. But what if that feeling of control is just a mirage? What if the very things we rely on to navigate the world, like our experience, our intelligence, our self-perception, are actually the invisible walls of a cognitive prison? Well, today we are looking at the hard data and some timeless philosophy to show exactly why we aren't quite as free as we think we are, and more importantly, how we can actually break out of the trap.
Okay, let's dive into this. Take a look at this tiny, somewhat terrifying number right here, 10 to 15%. Think about it. If you walk into a room and ask a huge crowd of people if they are self-aware, literally almost every single hand is going to shoot straight up. We all think we're the exception, don't we? We all believe we have this crystal clear grasp on our values, our weaknesses, and exactly how we impact other people. But organizational research, specifically a massive study looking at over 3,600 leaders, revealed a really startling reality. While almost everyone thinks they're highly self-aware, only 10 to 15% of people actually fit the criteria. That means for every 10 people who are absolutely dead certain they know themselves, about 9 of them are flying completely blind.
Which brings us to a rather direct question. Are you bold enough to find out if you actually belong in that 10 to 15%? It is incredibly easy to look at that statistic and just automatically assume you're in the enlightened minority. But the data shows us that assuming you are in that top tier is usually the very first symptom that you belong to the bottom 85%. Finding out the actual truth requires a serious willingness to tear down your own assumptions and look in the mirror without all those nice protective filters our egos naturally set up for us.
Now, you might be thinking that as we get older, as we climb the corporate ladder, as we gain more authority, we naturally just become wiser and way more self-aware. But actually, the exact opposite is true. Experience and power actively hinder self-awareness. It's a completely counterintuitive reality. You'd really expect that surviving the trenches of a long career would refine your understanding of yourself, right? But for the vast majority of leaders, we're talking 85 to 90%, accumulating power actually degrades their effectiveness and their ability to see themselves clearly.
So let's break down exactly how this happens. Why does power literally blind us? Well, when we reach a certain level of experience, this sort of cognitive laziness sets in. First off, we literally do less homework. We start relying heavily on our gut just because our gut has been right a few times in the past. Second, and this is a huge red flag, we completely stop seeking disconfirming evidence. If someone disagrees with us, we just assume they lack our vast experience. Third, we stop questioning our baseline assumptions. And finally, all of this snowballs into a massive, blinding overconfidence about our own self-knowledge. In fact, studies prove that higher-level leaders significantly overvalue their emotional self-awareness and empathy. As their power grows, their willingness to just stop and listen shrinks, mostly because seeking feedback suddenly feels like it undermines their authority.
To truly understand this blind spot, we have to look at how our brains trick us in everyday life. Let's introduce a fascinating concept from a University of Kent psychology study. It's called third-person perception, or TPP. This is the documented, scientifically proven tendency for people to believe that everyone else is super susceptible to persuasion, advertising, and manipulation, while we ourselves are somehow remarkably immune. You know the feeling. When you see a really cheesy infomercial selling a useless kitchen gadget, your brain instantly goes, "Who falls for that?" Well, clearly the masses do, but definitely not me. We suffer from this severe, almost comical illusion of personal invulnerability.
And this brilliantly illustrates the internal myth we all carry around with us. Just look at the stark contrast in how we view the self versus others. When researchers ask people to describe someone who is easily persuaded, they use words like gullible, weak-minded, impressionable, vulnerable. They assign all these traits to others. But when describing themselves, people claim they possess a high need for cognition, which is just a fancy psychological term meaning they love deep critical thinking. They see themselves as strong-minded, independent, and highly intelligent. We basically use these shared cultural assumptions to puff up our own egos. It's a downward social comparison where the rest of the world is a flock of mindless sheep and we alone are the fiercely independent wolves. It's a rather arrogant little trick our brains play on us, isn't it?
For the science fans joining us, the math entirely backs this up. The mediation models from that Kent study show exactly how our belief in our own capabilities drives this illusion.
If you look at the model on the left, it shows that simply because you can hear your own internal monologue, like you remember the times you've thought really deeply about a complex topic, you suffer from what's called an introspection illusion. You automatically assume others aren't thinking as deeply, purely because you can't hear their thoughts. So you conclude they're easily manipulated, and you are totally untouchable.
Now, what's amazing is that this modern psychological data aligns perfectly with what the great philosophers have been telling us for centuries. The 17th century philosopher Baruch Spinoza absolutely nailed this when he said, "We believe we are free because we ignore the causes that make us act." This false sense of absolute freedom is, at its core, pure pride. We like to think our choices are entirely original and independent simply because we lack the data to see the invisible strings that are actually pulling us.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how it visualizes this exact philosophical trap. It maps out two completely different versions of ourselves. Down here in the black oval, we have the submissive and ignorant self. This is our default state when we lack self-awareness. In this state, we're entirely shaped by invisible predispositions, our personal history, and the prejudices handed down by society. We basically act like biological machines just executing a pre-written program, running purely on emotion, reaction, and basic instinct. But if you look at the gold oval, we see the free and conscious self. Notice those arrows pointing up to it. Through the really hard work of gaining knowledge, stepping back and analyzing those influences, we can actually transition from that submissive self to a genuinely free self.
But if you want to achieve that free and conscious self, you first have to acknowledge the extremely heavy, invisible forces that are dictating your actions right now. First up is your genetic heritage. That's your DNA, your basic human instincts, and any inherited physical or mental predispositions. Second is your personal history, the specific environment of your childhood, your lived experiences, and the unique psychological coping mechanisms you developed just to survive them. And third is the immense weight of the influence of others, your education, the specific culture you belong to, your social groups, and human civilization at large. Listen, unless you actively investigate these forces, they are making your choices for you.
So how do we actually break the programming? The remedy is ancient. Gnothi know thyself. This was the inscription carved right onto the front of the Temple of Delphi in ancient Greece, and it became the core guiding principle for Socrates. It kicked off a philosophical tradition spanning thousands of years. Knowing yourself is not just some casual weekend hobby. It is an absolute necessity. It's literally the only way to shed light on those dark deterministic forces we just looked at. By understanding your environment and the psychological gears turning inside your head, you don't magically erase them, sure, but you do free yourself from the crushing weight of ignorance. You step out of the darkness and into an empowered state where you can actually exercise a real degree of free will.
So, the crucial point is, how do we actually do this in our modern, crazy day-to-day lives, especially when we already know our own brains are actively trying to trick us with overconfidence? Well, you have to aggressively seek out reality. You must seek frequent, hypercritical feedback, and you've got to accept it graciously. The absolute best way to shatter your own illusions is to ask for specific data. Communication expert Sheila Heen suggests two incredibly powerful questions you can literally start using today. Question 1, what is one thing you appreciate about me? This is great because it establishes trust. And question 2, what is one thing you see me doing or failing to do that is causing me to be less successful? You have to be specific here. This forces the people around you to hold up a mirror that your ego desperately wants to avoid looking into. Because if you refuse to do this work, the consequences are severe. The pioneering psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung warned us about this perfectly. He said, "What you don't want to know about yourself ends up coming from the outside as a destiny." If you choose to remain blind to your own flaws, your hidden determinisms, and the way you negatively impact the people around you, those unexamined traits will absolutely orchestrate your downfall. You'll end up blaming the world, you'll blame bad luck, you'll blame everybody else, and you'll just call it your destiny. But in reality, it was just the totally inevitable result of your own unexplored ignorance.
Which leaves us with one final, unavoidable challenge. We now know that 85% of us are out there living an illusion of self-awareness. We know our brains are actively hiding our vulnerabilities just to protect our pride. The only real way out of this trap is to pull the data from the outside world. So who are you going to ask for one piece of critical, honest feedback today? Are you really ready to take that first step toward true freedom? Think about it. See you next time in The Explainer.